Almost everything interesting about Butterfly McQueen happened in the space between what she played and who she actually was. The gap between those two things was enormous. She spent her entire adult life negotiating it. She was born Thelma McQueen in Tampa, Florida, in January 1911. When she was 5 years old, her father left the family entirely. The practical solution was to send Thelma south to live with her aunt in Augusta, Georgia, while her mother found her footing up north. So Thelma grew up caught between two places: a small southern city where she attended school, and the idea of New York, where her mother was building something she would eventually come to claim. Augusta shaped her in ways that stayed with her the rest of her life. She was a black girl in the Jim Crow South, and the world she moved through was legislated at every level. The schools she could attend, the seats she could occupy on public transportation, the doors that were simply closed, none of it was subtle. She was also, by all accounts, a kid who paid close attention. She later talked about growing up watching films produced by Oscar McQueen, the pioneering black filmmaker whose work showed African Americans as full human beings. McQueen's characters were ambitious, complicated, striving. That was her frame of reference for what storytelling could be. She made her way to New York as a teenager, eventually landing in Harlem and the Bronx. She had some idea of becoming a nurse, and she did enroll briefly in the Lincoln Training School for Nursing in the Bronx. But it didn't hold her. A high school teacher had already planted a different idea, suggesting that she had something worth developing as a performer. She started studying dance. She trained with Katherine Dunham, Jeffrey Holder, and Janet Collins, teachers who were serious about craft. She found her way to the Venezuela Jones Youth Theater Group in Harlem, a company that gave young black performers a place to work and train. Most professional stages in the city were closed to them. The group was a workaround, a way of staying in motion. In 1935, the group staged a production of A Midsummer Night's Dream. Thelma McQueen danced in what was billed as the Butterfly Ballet. The name stuck, and the other performers started calling her Butterfly for the way her hands moved constantly when she performed. She liked it enough to eventually make it legal. She had always hated the name Thelma. From that point forward, she was Butterfly McQueen, not a stage invention, but, as she saw it, something closer to the truth. She was not renaming herself for a publicist or a studio. She was renaming herself because she wanted to. Her Broadway debut came in 1937 in a production called Brown Sugar, directed by George Abbott. The show lasted 4 performances, but a reviewer from the New York Times noticed her anyway, describing what he called the extraordinary artistry of this high-stepping creature who called herself Butterfly McQueen. 4 performances and a favorable notice in the Times. That was her start. Abbott kept working with her, and she appeared in 2 more of his productions, Brother Rat in 1937 and What a Life in 1938. She was still working in What a Life when a talent scout named Kay Brown walked into the theater. Brown worked for David O. Selznick, who was in the early stages of producing the most expensive film that Hollywood had ever attempted. Gone with the Wind had been a best-selling novel since 1936, and Selznick was determined to make the definitive American epic. Brown spotted McQueen and recommended her for the role of Prissy. What happened next was a small farce. Selznick's team initially rejected her. She was, in their estimation, too old. She was 28, and the character was a teenage girl. Too heavy, too dignified. The word dignified is worth sitting with. The very quality that made her unsuitable in their eyes was the quality she most actually had. Eventually, Selznick saw her screen test and reversed the decision. He chose no one else for the part. McQueen later said he had seen something in her voice and comic timing that he could not find anywhere else. The role of Prissy was an enslaved girl attached to the O'Hara household, scattered and squealing, and famous for claiming she knew how to deliver babies when she plainly did not. It was a version of black womanhood designed to be laughed at. McQueen understood this perfectly. She had read the novel before shooting began. The more she read, the more it bothered her. She said later that the part was so backward that Prissy was always whining and complaining, always performing stupidity. She had thought the film would show the progress black people had made, and it did not. She did not want to be that little slave, as she put it, but she took the job. The calculation was one that black performers of her era understood with great clarity. The roles available were what they were, and if you wanted to be in the room at all, you found a way to be in the room. Hattie McDaniel, who played Mammy in the same film and would go on to win the Academy Award for it, made a version of this argument explicitly. She said she'd rather play a maid than be one. McDaniel had gone to her audition dressed in period costume, showing Selznick she would commit fully. McQueen spent the shoot in a state of active negotiation. She refused to eat watermelon on camera and spit out the seeds, which was one of the more openly humiliating things she was asked to do. She refused to accept a line of dialogue in which Rhett Butler was to refer to Prissy as a simple-minded darky. She objected to wearing her hair in the traditional wrapped head style that the costume department had planned. She lost that one. The head covering stayed, and she wore it. But she drew the lines she could draw, and she held them. Years later, she joked that she might have regretted the watermelon refusal. "It could have been funny," she said, Prissy calmly spitting seeds while Atlanta burned around her. But she wasn't in a position to be relaxed about any of it in 1939. Hattie McDaniel told McQueen during production that she would never work in Hollywood again. "You complain too much," McDaniel said. It was not a cruel thing to say so much as a practical one. McDaniel knew how the industry operated. McQueen knew it too. But she had a different relationship to what she was willing to absorb in order to stay in it. The two women were not in conflict about politics. They were in conflict about strategy. Both of them were right, in their own ways, about what it cost. The film opened in December 1939 at Loew's Grand Theater in Atlanta. McQueen could not attend the premiere. It was held at a whites-only venue. This was the film's gala debut, one of the most celebrated cultural events of the decade, and the black members of its cast were not welcome at it. The cast had made the film. They were not invited to celebrate it. There is something almost too obvious about that fact. The film glorified the antebellum South, and its black performers were treated in a manner that the antebellum South would have recognized. Nobody seemed to notice the irony, or at least nobody who had the power to change it. The role made McQueen famous in a way she hadn't been before, and couldn't fully use afterward. It also made her a target. The NAACP boycotted the film. Malcolm X would later write that he was embarrassed by Prissy. "McQueen got used to being hated for it," she said. The people who hated the character sometimes forgot, or did not bother to care, that there was a real woman underneath it. She had fought against the most degrading parts of the role from inside the production, and the people criticizing her from the outside couldn't see any of that. Hollywood cast her as a maid again, and again. The 1940s were a steady procession of essentially the same role under different names in different films. Each time, the character was some version of Prissy, scattered, comic, servile. She appeared in Cabin in the Sky in 1943, a musical with genuine talent in its cast. She appeared in Mildred Pierce in 1945, made by Michael Curtiz, one of the best studio directors working at the time. She played opposite Joan Crawford. Her role in Mildred Pierce was uncredited. A woman who had turned in one of the most recognizable performances in one of the most famous films ever made was, 6 years later, not even credited in the film she was appearing in. That was the state of things. Duel in the Sun came in 1946. That was the last one she was willing to do. In 1947, she quit. The decision was not made lightly, and it was not celebrated at the time. She was 36 years old, and walking away from the only major industry that had ever employed her as a performer. She left because the work on offer required her to keep performing the same character, a version of black womanhood that existed to be ridiculous, to have no inner life worth the audience's attention. She had said what she had to say about the limits of that, and Hollywood had not moved. So she moved. It was a deliberate choice, and she did not dress it up as anything else. What followed was a decade and a half of work that had nothing to do with being on a screen. She worked as a maid. This is one of the stranger facts about her life, that she spent years doing the labor Hollywood had insisted was her natural destiny. But now she was doing it herself, for income she controlled. The studio was gone. The humiliation was not required. She worked as a companion to an elderly white woman. She dispatched cabs. She worked the toy department at Macy's. She sewed at Saks Fifth Avenue. She told a British interviewer decades later that she took any honest job that came her way, and she said it without shame. It was a statement of principle. She was not going to demean herself on screen for a paycheck. She would do any real work instead. The distinction mattered to her. Distinction. She did not vanish from performing entirely. She appeared on Broadway occasionally in smaller productions. In the early 1950s, she appeared on the television show Beulah, playing a supporting character named Oriole, Beulah's friend. Though the irony of returning to a show built around yet another black domestic was not lost on her. She also moved back to Augusta for a stretch in the 1950s and early 1960s, giving music lessons, hosting her own radio show, and opening a restaurant. None of it lasted, but she kept moving. She had always kept moving. Then came 1963, and one of the stranger detours of a strange career. Stone Mountain Park, outside Atlanta, hired Butterfly McQueen to greet visitors at its newly opened antebellum plantation attraction. She was to live in the plantation house kitchen and welcome tourists. The park had been built around the world's largest Confederate monument, and it was promoting itself as a living piece of the Old South. The woman who had played Scarlett O'Hara's slave was now being asked to inhabit that fantasy in person for paying visitors in the state of Georgia in 1963. She took the job, she left in 1965, and when the park continued using her photograph to promote the attraction afterward, she threatened a lawsuit. And by 1968, they stopped. The calculation of what she had agreed to, and why, belongs to her alone. But it is hard to read that chapter without thinking about what the 1940s had already cost her, and what the options looked like by then. By the mid-1960s, she was back in Harlem, working as a waitress, then as a receptionist at the Mount Morris Park Recreation Center. She taught children there, tap dancing and ballet. She played Santa Claus in children's hospitals. She volunteered as a playground supervisor at an elementary school. This is not the story of a broken woman retreating from the world. It is the story of someone who decided that the world of prestige and visibility had too high a price, and who found other ways to be useful, ways that nobody was going to put on a marquee. In 1968, she returned to Broadway, playing a character called Hattie in the musical Curly McDimple. A year later, she had her own revue, Butterfly McQueen and Friends. And in 1974, she was in the original cast of The Wiz when it debuted in Baltimore. Before the show went to Broadway and became a phenomenon, she was there at the beginning of it. She went back to school, and this was not a casual project. She had been taking classes on and off since the mid-1940s, working through the City College of Los Angeles, UCLA, Southern Illinois University, Queens College, and NYU at different points over the years. The subject was political science, mostly. She was interested in how power worked. In 1975, at 64 years old, she graduated from the City College of New York with a bachelor's degree in political science. She was one of 3,500 students who received degrees at that commencement. She had been working toward it, off and on, for nearly 30 years. That is a particular kind of stubbornness. That same year, she was inducted into the Black Filmmakers Hall of Fame. The recognition was real, and she accepted it. But she was not the kind of person who organized her life around accumulating honors. The degree meant more to her. There was a side of Butterfly McQueen that had always been present, but that the public mostly encountered later in her life. She was an atheist, not privately, not quietly, but openly and without apology. She had arrived at this position essentially in childhood and never softened it. She said Christianity appeared to her as the most absurd imposture of all the religions. She said that people who have God do not have to be nice to you, because they know they will be forgiven. But since she had no one to forgive her, she had to be nice on her own. It was a striking way to put it. She was not angry about religion, she was clear about it. There is a difference. In 1981, she joined the Freedom from Religion Foundation, a national organization of atheists and agnostics. She became a life member and contributed to the acquisition of the foundation's hall in Madison, Wisconsin. She took the membership seriously. In 1989, at the Foundation's National Convention in Atlanta, held during the 50th anniversary of Gone with the Wind, she was given the organization's very first Free Thought Heroine Award. After brief remarks and a poetry recitation, she sat down with the Foundation's co-president, Dan Barker, who accompanied her on piano while she sang Paper Moon. She was 78 years old. Around this same period, in 1980, a jury awarded her $60,000 in a lawsuit she had filed against two bus terminal security guards who had accused her of being a pickpocket and thrown her roughly onto a bench. She was 69 at the time of the assault and had several ribs damaged. She sued and she won. It was characteristic of her. She did not absorb injuries quietly. She came back to film and television in small doses. In 1979, she won a Daytime Emmy Award for her performance as Aunt Thelma, a fairy godmother, in the ABC after-school special episode, 7 Wishes of a Rich Kid. In 1986, she had a role in The Mosquito Coast with Harrison Ford, and appeared in a PBS television adaptation of The Adventures of Huckleberry Finn the same year. Her final appearance was in the 1989 television film Polly, a reimagining of the Pollyanna story with an all-black cast. She lived in New York in the summers and Augusta in the winters in her later years. She kept her winters quiet. Her Augusta neighbors knew her as Thelma. She did not want people to know who she was. This was not false modesty. It was a genuine preference for a life that was not organized around being recognized. The woman who had been barred from the premiere of her own film now chose, deliberately, to live without the attention that had come with it. On December 26, 1995, she tried to light a kerosene heater in her cottage near Augusta. She was 84. The heater ignited badly, and her clothes caught fire. Firefighters found her outside on the sidewalk, already burning. She had second and third-degree burns over 70% of her body. She died the next day at Augusta Regional Medical Center. Her body was donated for medical research. It came out afterward that she had left money in her will to the Freedom from Religion Foundation. And this surprised a great many people who had not been paying close attention to who she actually was. She made choices throughout her life that were genuinely her own. To refuse certain scenes, to walk away from the industry, to spend years doing ordinary labor without apology, to get her degree at 64, to be openly atheist when that carried its own professional costs. The tragedy of her career was real. So was the integrity of what she built outside of it. The prissy role still follows her. What she said about it, in the end, was that she wasn't happy at 28, but that the role was part of Black history, and that things change, things blossom with time. It was not a forgiving statement, it was an honest one. The name she chose, not the name she was given, was Butterfly. It came from a dance, and she made it permanent. She chose it early, and she kept choosing it, even when choosing it looked like teaching children ballet in Harlem, or studying political science in middle age, or singing Paper Moon at 78 while the room paid attention.